Hey, folks, I have officially run out of hard drive space, which means it's update time. There's been so much progress scattered across multiple projects I work on that I think making a single video might not be such a great idea anymore. Last one, or maybe 2 videos ago, it was 3 hours long, I think. 3 hours long, so nobody's watching that shit. Let's maybe do independent videos for the independent projects when they accumulate enough progress. And this one's going to be about Dreadtail. Hopefully, this way we'll be able to keep the video under the 1 hour mark. Maybe. Before we begin, as of the making of this video, there are now 3 people beside me, I don't know if I should count myself, working on the Dreadtail project. So there's Dimitar, who's a gentleman from Bulgaria, doing 3D modeling on all sorts of props and texturing. We've got Antoine from Quebec, who's also doing props and 3D modeling, which, you know, in the 3D project is pretty much the giant bulk of the workload. And then finally, we got Cole Harmon from US doing sound effects. Everybody on the team has been putting amazing effort putting together props and assets to get this project underway. So let's get right into it. Here's a fun little mechanic: a wall-mounted medical box. In order to give additional reason to come back to previously explored locations, these medical boxes are going to randomly spawn in the various chunks, which is something that's true for a number of important props all over the map, like the crafting stations, resource caches, and supply cabinets. All these props are here to give additional purpose to each and every location, so that if the player discovers a chunk in the middle of the swamp, it isn't just a one-trick pony, one-and-done deal. They have a reason to come back to it, which is why I try to give every, or at least almost every location, a secondary or a third purpose. Now, the player can take damage in this game and they need to be able to heal themselves, but I didn't want to make every single healable item to be an inventory item that they can carry with themselves. So in the case of this medical box, it acts a lot more like the healing station in the Half-Life games, where you just walk up to it and you use it. Nothing actually gets stored. The player is still going to get their inventory items they can use to heal, but this one is kind of like a, well, imagine you're low on your health and you're running away from something, you're running to something, and then you notice a bunker chunk that you've been to before that you know has a medical kit inside of it. Well, might as well take a small detour. With the amount of time we're spending on props, locations, decoratives, it makes sense to make a location to have more than one purpose. I tried putting a little bit more time into blocking out the communications office, which is supposed to be a central location that the players will find themselves returning to in order to get direction, get coordinates, and just get some bearings of where they need to go next. The communications office has a number of zones or rooms that are locked away, and the player needs to unlock them as they progress through the story. Now, the biggest gripe about modeling out this particular location is how unbelievably long it takes just to get some basic geometry in place. I had basically hand modeled, and more or less kind of loosely, every wall, every ceiling, every damaged surface. It is frankly taking an unbelievably large amount of time to just kind of block out something basic, and it's not even guaranteed to really work. I know that a lot of people are going to say that you're supposed to start with block meshing for this location, but block meshing is supposed to help you figure out the layout of the space, and we already know what the layout should be. It's the actual process of creating all these walls that's kind of a drag. I'm not going to be doing this for too much longer because eventually I will succumb to the modular-itis and end up creating like a modular set of bunker kit walls, floors, ceilings, crumbled surfaces and crumbled sides, which can be used like Lego pieces to build out larger spaces without having to, extrude more walls. And the problem with this particular approach, where everything is just built right then and there, is that the final result may actually just be scrapped, and it sucks. So yeah, part of the learning process. Like, I have to go through this pain in the assery in order to start thinking, how can I make my own life easier and how can I speed this process up? I also find myself that when I'm blocking out an environment, I tend to go for some boring ass layouts. It just boxes everywhere. And then I think, okay, well, maybe I should start looking at references. And then I Google references, and it's the same boring ass shit that I've seen before. It is actually unremarkable how uninteresting hyper-optimized living or workspaces really are. It really seems like soul-crushing, spiritless, hyper-production squeezing environments. Like the primary purpose of these spaces really feels like to eliminate as many distractions as possible, so you just feel depressed and have nothing left to do but to get some work done. It really stresses the point of how much an artistic approach level design is, because you're trying to create something that looks and feels interesting to traverse, which if a real, let's say, civil engineer or architect would take a look at, they would just roll their eyes and say this is not an office or bunker or any sort of productivity environment. So I'm gonna be looking into maybe introducing a bit more angles and maybe even the verticality into my level layouts, but so far this is what we got. One of the ways we're going to control the progression of the story is through the use of padlocked doors. I think it'll be important to keep in mind that we should never have a location that has one of these doors and then nothing else to do. Otherwise, it's very easy to just forget about it entirely. With a decent number of locations, we're going to give the player a reason to come back to them the second time, the third time to unlock pieces of the story. With this particular prop, of course, in order to get through, you're going to have to know the passcode. And this is where I'm going to borrow the very thing that I initially hated about the Deathloop game, and it's the fact that every single safe, every single door, every single padlock is randomized. So which means that no two players game is going to have the same key codes for anything, thus guaranteeing that there's zero chance that a story is going to be told out of order. All of the key codes are randomly generated at the beginning of the gameplay and then persist throughout the rest of the game. Now, my approach to handling the keypad is basically going to involve the player looking at a specific key, pressing a button, and then that key is going to be pressed, and the number of the key will be logged in the padlock code. There are other ways that technically this can be handled, like for example, you interact with a padlock, a piece of user interface appears, and then you punch in the number using your mouse. That's also another good way to do it. And finally, there's the, well, you look at the thing and punch in the numbers on the keyboard. I've not really seen a lot of games that did that. I never really got why. We're not really taking this approach in this game, so maybe that kind of explains it. But it's kind of like in Helldivers, when you're trying to activate something, it has that little pattern that you type in, up, down, left, right, down, and then it works there. Who knows, maybe it was the closest thing I could do to getting a physically interactable mechanic with the keypad, because I already have other props here, like the cabinets, supply cabinets, which the player have to click and then drag their mouse in order to open the door, kind of like what you have to do in Amnesia, in the frictional games like Soma, the Bunker. So maybe looking physically at the key and pressing a button just makes more sense, because it aligns much more with this type of interaction. Now, the funny thing is, having figured out the button presses on the keypad, I figured I'm going to propagate the same mechanic to the button presses on the tape recorder, or the tape player. You may or may not have seen this in the past. It's a tape player. It's a pretty ubiquitous way of delivering narrative. And on the subject of tape player interaction, my God, did I decide to absolutely over-bloody engineer the entire interaction on this tape player. Like, I've got inserting of the tape into the machine, I've got rewinding, I've got fast forwarding, stop, playback, I've got the tape player refusing to allow you to take out the tape until you rewind it. Like, was all of that really necessary? There we go. My God, if I had stuck to just a simple mechanic of play and then auto rewind, this would have been perfect. But no, I needed to be able to rewind the tapes. Why? I don't know. I think I had an idea for some sort of a mechanic, like somewhere during the tape you can hear something in the background and you need to use it in order to bypass an obstacle. But I think the amount of time I've spent on making the state machine, all the conditions, making sure that the rewinding works, the fast forwarding works, and the playback, and it stops and restarts in the proper time, and the pitch up and the pitch down and all that stuff. Dear God, not worth it. Maybe only for the experience of knowing what it's like to program a tape recorder like this. So many games have figured this out already by this point. You have a tape, you walk up to it, you press a button, it plays the audio, done. As a matter of fact, I think I was so fed up with this bullshit that I decided to switch gears and just work on some props. Which, guess what? This was the very beginning of me finally looking at designing some sort of a kit of walls that I could easily use to build out various bunker locations. These don't really have a particular, well, format or dimension to them. It was just kind of a whatever experiment. In the end, the easiest and by far the fastest way of creating these interesting bunker pieces or wall pieces would be to use a Bezier curve tool in Blender and then use my graphics tablet to actually paint out the various shapes. Then make sure not to forget to turn the Bezier curve to be a poly curve, convert it to mesh, fuse the edges to get myself a one big ass face, and extrude it to get some wall thickness. After I figure that out, pretty much creating all sorts of additional bunker pieces is just easy, breezy, lemon something. But let me tell you, probably the best decision in this entire project. And the idea for it was spanned off of the GDC talk for the Fallout 4 and Fallout 3 level design team. How they basically created a whole bunch of prefabricated walls and floors and holes in the walls and windows and door frames and all that stuff, and they just used them as Lego pieces to build out whatever locations they deemed necessary. Now, they did have a lot of grid-based stuff. I didn't go for grids because I thought that there's just going to be way too many things to try to figure out, way too many turns and corners and slopes, and especially when we're talking about damaged walls, right? There's just permutations and permutations of all sorts of damage levels. So instead of a grid map, I just went with nice little prefabricated components. Curiously enough, when I posted the progress on the Godot subreddit, a lot of people were confused when I called them prefabs, because apparently it's a Unity thing. It is most certainly not a Unity thing. The term prefabs have existed long before Unity was even conceived. It is any prefabricated component that you use to build out your level. Could be a hallway, could be a portion of a room, could be just a single wall. So for all intents and purposes, all the walls and floors and bunker pieces that I'm putting together here are prefabricated components out of which I built out the hallways, the rooms, and the spaces. In other news, man, when I discovered the tool scripts and just how easy they are to create, I gotta say, I started to wonder, where has this been all my life? Like, for example, in the case of this little prop. It's a little destroyed cabinet, but of course, if you just have one destroyed cabinet, then you start using it everywhere and it kind of gets recognized as a pattern. It just looks lazy. So having multiple variations of the same prop would help, but then we have a problem of having to create 5 different scenes and then, having to hand place them everywhere. So I figured, just for the sake of an experiment for this prop, I'm going to turn it into a tool by turning the script into a tool script and giving it the ability to swap out what kind of inner mesh for the shelves it is going to use. And it all just boils down to having an inspector property, an export variable that detects when you change the value, and it automatically loads up a different design for the prop and places it in the mesh instance. Come to think of it, in Substance Painter, when you're baking something, which is a little tip courtesy of Dimitar, you can actually mark objects to not cast occlusion onto each other if they are not named the same, which means I can have a single Substance Painter project which textures all of the variations of the shelves in one single texture, and then, well, we don't have to deal with like 5 different materials for 5 different designs. So, tool scripts. Go learn them. They're super useful. Somebody asked me a question when I was showcasing the progress for this project on the Godot subreddit, and it's the fact that why are some things textured and others not? I think somebody else recognized the same pattern in their own work, and it's the fact that you can make an experience with untextured models, but having no models kind of makes it a lot more difficult. Yes, I could work with boxes, but to be honest, I am trying to hone in on what the game is going to feel like as early as possible, and I can't really do that with, placeholder boxes and cubes and cylinders. Most of the time, I have a relatively good idea of what it is that I'm modeling and what it is the certain prop needs to look like. So most often than not, I will actually just go out and model the prop in question. Now, where modeling would take maybe an hour and a bit, and then I would have an actual model to work with, texturing usually takes an hour and a bit, but for every prop that I make, if I spend yet another hour and a half for texturing, that's just that much more time I'm not spending actually programming the prop. And once again, it all comes down to the fact that I can make a mechanic without a texture. I can't really make a mechanic with just no model. I mean, technically I can, but again, I don't want to sacrifice being able to see what I'm working with. Considering we have limited resources to work with, I try not to spend too much time on, let's say, unnecessary in-betweens. For example, between having an idea for a mechanic and then having that mechanic fully finished and implemented, you would have the placeholder prop, the rough prop, the clean prop, the texture, maybe a second revision of the texture. Who knows, maybe even before you start modeling in the first place, there's going to be a concept sketch, second concept sketch, there's going to be some sort of a design document of how the mechanic works. This is kind of the benefit of being the director and the creative team of your own project. It's the fact that you don't have to spend an excessive amount of time taking your idea and then putting it down on paper as concept art or design documents so you can communicate it to the actual modeler or actual designer and then have them understand and be on the same page as you are. You are the one who's making the prop, so just make it according to your own vision. At that point, you just need to be confident that you have the skills to be able to realize it. Now, I decided to texture the tape recorder or tape player because Cole, the sound engineer, wanted to make a little video presenting his work on the sound effects for that prop, and I figured it might be nice if the prop was actually textured and didn't look like a bunch of grid boxes, so that his presentation would look nice. There should be a link in the description or down in the pinned comments where you can find his report on the sound effects. Now, the funny thing is, contrary to what I just said, sometimes I actually need to just shut my brain off because I've been doing so much of a certain thing, like programming a mechanic, that I just need a switch of paces and do something completely creative. Like, for example, in this case, I decided to work on that little bunker wall light. And you know what? It's a fairly simple prop, so model it and texture it all in one go. I did.
Good props we have.
Even though I have people helping me out working on the props and objects for this game, I still spend a lot of time doing props myself because I find the process to be interesting, enjoyable. Like, my plan for the future is that eventually, at some point, I would like to work on a third-person game that involves actors, framing camera shots of heavy voiceovers, stuff like facial animations, maybe some mocap data. I would like to be able to do that. So now I spend my evenings doing a little bit of practice, drawing and 3D sculpting and doing all that jazz. Just trying to get some practice in so that by the time I do get to the point when I want to make a, let's say, third-person game, I will have the skills necessary to pull it off, and it's not going to be one of those, training on job site type things. The goal is to figure out enough to at least not have any idea of where to go or how to approach certain third-person camera, actor, 3D animation problems and challenges. Next thing I decided to tackle is a subject that has been long on the list, and it's something I would have had to learn anyways, which is manipulating multi-mesh instance nodes. This is I would say, a semi-open world-ish game. It's basically a really big swamp, which means there's going to have to be a lot of trees, a lot of debris, a lot of rocks, a lot of bushes, a lot of static props that are there just to set up the scene. I am not going to be placing each and every single tree by hand. No thank you. And of course, if I want to circumvent that need, I have to learn about the tools that are designed specifically for the purpose. The multi-mesh instance node is there to help you handle large amounts of items. The only thing is that this node is very raw. A lot of its functionality, like here, let's place 1,000 trees, you have to actually program yourself through the use of multi-mesh instance functions. As a matter of fact, the multi-mesh instance is just a container. The real thing that you end up running functions functions on is the resource that is the multi-mesh resource of the node itself. So if you go into the multi-mesh node documentation and you see literally nothing, don't worry, you just have to look into the multi-mesh resource properties instead. So having only just started using tool scripts, I immediately started making a tool for scattering components on the terrain. And yes, I know that there is probably not one, but several scattering tools, including the proton scatter, but I have had trouble with proton scatter when I started experimenting, and I thought, you know what, I might as well learn how to do this myself so that I'm not dependent on someone else's plugins and someone else's whims on fixing their bugs. My entire life has been all about eventually learning that it's better to be self-sufficient and just learn the skill to be able to do it yourself so that you're not stuck having to rely on someone else. Too many times in my life, I found myself in a place where I say to myself, well, I gotta do this myself anyways. And it might seem kind of cynical and disrespectful considering that I am now working with multiple people beside myself, and you wouldn't be wrong either. It's just that it's much better to be a warrior in the garden than a gardener in the war. That being said, being able to take over or continue working and have the skill set to be able to build the tools you need, but not necessarily having to use them at this moment in time. And I can tell you, this exploration of the multi-mesh instances has taken place quite a while ago, and since then I can tell you I'm very quite much thankful that I decided to explore it and figure this out, because I have created a multitude of really useful productivity tools using the multi-mesh instance since the time I made this video. Sometimes you just can't substitute a good in-house tool, and so far, by and large, every time I've taken the time to learn and discover some sort of a new node and its functionality, it has been an overwhelming net benefit to my productivity and just the quality that I can deliver through these projects. But despite the fact that I continue doing 3D modeling and texturing and still continue doing sound effects and audio works, I'm still eternally grateful to the folks who are helping me out to bring this project up to speed. Now, the tool-making exploration have actually been exceptionally handy for populating this entire swampland with a bunch of foliage. We have created the tool that uses a multi-mesh to place a bunch of trees and also place a bunch of collision objects to make sure those trees can't just be phased through. But now we had a problem that we have this giant map, we need to populate it with a lot of trees, and we can't use a single multi-mesh instance to do so because, first of all, it has a limit of 64,000 something units of multiplication. So that means there can only be 64,000 more or less rounded instances of the a single prop. And this really comes down to a technical limitation that the multi-mesh instance can only store 16 bits worth of data for each and every instance, and the maximum number of a 16-bit integer is 64,000 something. Any larger, and well, to be honest, once I get like 2,000 props, the frame rate starts taking a deep shit. Anyways, so I don't think there's a single node in Godot engine that can just solve bad optimization and bad level design. So I had to split up the entire swampland into a grid of multi-mesh instances, each responsible for populating a particular small chunk of trees. And once again, this is exactly where the tool scripts have come in so handy, because all I had to do is create a single tool script which manipulated the other multi-mesh tool scripts. All it would do is essentially instance the tree automatic placement tool as many times as there need be and distribute them evenly all throughout the swampland. So once again, tool scripts help you automate so many mundane and very boring tasks. And now we're kind of getting into the territory of a tool script controlling another tool script in order to automate giant workloads in just a matter of a few minutes work. Again, tool scripts, go learn them. Now, when it comes to the gameplay mechanics and the obstacles and resolutions that the player goes through, a lot of the stuff I end up coming up as new factors come into light, as new level props or new level segments are being put together, and it's kind of happens on the fly, where I look at something and I figure, this would be a cool place to have so-and-so mechanic or prop for the player to take care of. And in this particular case, I got an idea for a radio tower, a prop or a location, one of several locations in the middle of the swamp that the player needs to visit and enable something, fix something, bring the thing up and running online. Basically a bunch of post-apocalyptic sci-fi fan service stuff. So for a lot of things, there is really no design document outside of just my Trello to-do list and the story. To be honest, I think the story is pretty much the only thing that holds everything together, because for me, the story is the glue that the entire experience is built around of. I don't really make arcade games, or at least I stopped worrying about making arcade games because there's just so many arcade games without any narrative weight to them, or the narrative is basically just tucked into the ether of the logs or lore or books or logs or computer terminal entries, far away from the main gameplay. I like when the story is at the forefront of the game. So in my case, the story pretty much almost often becomes the design document, the thing that holds the whole game together, and all the game mechanics revolve around progressing the player's story forward. And most of the time, I will have the fundamental progression of the main story figured out, and then after that, it's just a matter of introducing a bunch of helping factors and obstruction factors, which can manifest themselves as locations, obstacles, things for the player to do, tools or machinery for the player to fix and enable. So while the whole story is pretty much built out, these sort of random spurs of inspiration act as enrichment for the main gameplay and the main story progression. Now, I'm sure that if I was working in a much larger team, I would have no choice then to have some sort of design document, or even if I was trying to find financing for the project, right? Budgeting, getting some sort of funding for it. Yeah, there's no way around it. I'd have to have a design document, concept art, all sorts of mood boards, all that wild nonsense. All of this stuff is meant to help you communicate your idea to other people. In my case, because I think I have relatively decent artistic skills, I can do the same job by actually working on the game and actually creating the props, the environments, and communicating my idea through that. Now, the funny thing is, I say that, and yet this very prop that you see me work on, in this case, I actually ended up scrapping because it didn't really look like the thing I intended to make, which is a radio tower or some sort of a transceiver tower. I think predominantly it was the cross-section mesh thing that kind of made it look more like a vineyard container for, vines to grow on. It didn't really have that, industrial electrical radio tower vibe to it, but it's in the game file, so I might be able to find a use for it, if anything. I ended up redesigning the radio tower, which is supposed to be a key component for completing the final quest. I ended up going for a much more tubular design. And sometimes I want to implement some sort of a spectacle. So with this tower design, I wanted to make a multi-stage retractable mechanism, and enabling it was going to be like a major important event in the game. So I really wanted to make the animation be drawn out and slow and dramatic, and I wanted the wings of the radio tower to span out like a moth coming out of its cocoon, and the whole thing accompanied by just metal rustling and riveting and breaking and squeaking and all sorts of metal nonsense. Not to mention a nice dramatic soundtrack that would signify the importance of this thing becoming coming back to life. One particularly annoying component I had to figure out was making collisions for the multi-mesh tree distribution tool. I mentioned that I did get it to work in the end, but the general principle of it was that for some reason, when you spawn collision shapes, and even when you give them an owner, they don't physically seem to appear in the editor, so you can't really see them. I don't know if that may be because I was setting something up incorrectly, but that made debugging or just trying to figure out whether or not the collisions were just even there in the first place very difficult. Now, in the end, the general approach to it was actually quite simple. For the trees that you see here, it's actually just one same tree over and over and over again, scaled and rotated at random intervals. And because it's the same exact tree, all I had to do was was generate a collision shape, a very simplified collision shape, and I would simply use the transforms of each and every tree instance to also apply those same exact transforms onto the collision shapes. So we have one multi-mesh instance containing all the trees. Within the multi-mesh instance, we have a static body node, and then within that static body node, we have many collision shapes for each and every tree. Now, in the examples of these kind of distribution nodes where collisions have to be involved, I see people using cylinders, collision-shaped cylinders, to create collisions for their trees, but the shapes of the trees here are a little bit more complex, so I couldn't just get away with a regular cylinder, so thus a simplified collision shape simply works. Now, according to Bastian Ali, a gentleman who's been keeping an eye out on previous devlogs, had mentioned that once collisions are placed, they are locked with the collision server and they no longer cost any performance. So I think, even though we have hundreds of trees with hundreds of collision shapes, that shouldn't really be a problem. And so far, I can't say that I've seen any performance dips once the trees have been populated. Now, whenever I make these development logs, sometimes I come across prop making footage, which there's very little I can comment on making props. It's the same process from a tree to a stump to a tire to a radio. Like, for example, here I had put together a lumber mill location, a log processing plant, and there's really not a whole lot to say except, look, I made something. So sometimes I just question whether or not I even need to include them in the update report. What do you guys think? Does the progress report need a video explaining every single little prop? Now, you see, when we have a problem and it needs to have some sort of a creative or pragmatic or artistic solution, that makes for the meat and potatoes of these videos. Like, for example, a particular issue that is going to be, a persistent pain in the butt with all of the random locations the player can discover in the swamp is the fact that these locations are randomly placed, which means, let's say this area here could appear in the middle of a dip or a hill or in the middle of a swamped watered area. Somehow I need to make sure that no part of a location is, say, submerged underground, and maybe there's a terminal or note or key or some sort of an important prop that has somehow ended up underground. So my solution to this issue is going to be to create a series of foundations, ripped out concrete foundations, which can be placed under any location in order to elevate it from the ground. So the foundation is going to be long enough or deep enough that we can pretty much spawn a chunk anywhere in the terrain, and it will pretty much guarantee that it will never sink any of its important bits under the surface of the soil. Of course, more testing is going to be required. I'll probably have to create some sort of an automated script that is going to go through every location, every spawn location for these chunks, and then try to spawn every random location in that spot to double check if everything is okay. It's kind of the boring part of making randomly generated levels. Now, another gameplay mechanic that I ended up paying a bit more attention here is the swamp areas or the watered areas. When the player goes through them, they need to be slowed down, and the deeper they go in the water, the slower their stride becomes. Now, until this point, this was handled by checking the player's Y coordinate, and then as soon as it dropped below a certain level, their motion speed will slow down. They would switch to a little puddle footstep sound, and eventually when they get deep enough, they would go slow down to a crawl, and now they're just kind of treading through some pretty heavy water. The problem is that there were so many teeny tiny little pockets in the game where the player wasn't really supposed to be in the water, or maybe the level chunk or the bunker chunk has the player descend down a little bit, and they would now be underwater. Yes, technically there is a water table and it would be pretty uniform across the terrain, but it didn't make sense because in that case I was limited to having either have all the bunker chunks all above water, or I would have to resort to somehow canceling out the effect, placing down exclusion zones, or I have to quite literally elevate the terrain up so that I could dig it down and then place a location in the dip. So the solution to this was to use an area node and a collision polygon node in order to define rough locations of where the wetlands would begin. So if the player walks into the wetlands region, which could, because it's a collision polygon, I can actually define all sorts of wiggly boundaries for that region. As soon as the player walks into that region, they're automatically considered to be in the wetlands, and then when they drop below a certain Y coordinate, the whole slowness mechanic kicks in. The idea is to make the level, even though it's this big open space, to create passages and traversal routes for the player to consider. Let's say if they're being chased by an enemy or some unholy thing, and they need to kind of look around their surroundings and make sure that they don't just go straight through the water, because they will be slowed down and they will be an easy target for the enemy. And even though the majority of the terrain is flatlands, it creates these pockets of danger that the player needs to consider. Who knows, maybe I'll even borrow some certain ideas from Amnesia. Stay out of the water. As I've been working on the gameplay mechanics, I noticed that there's a certain problem, a reoccurring problem between multiple projects that I work on. And it's the fact that because I am the one who's making the game, I know how it works. And oftentimes when I make the game available, I will have people messaging me like, how do we do this? And how do we do that? I don't know how this mechanic works. And I'm like, it's pretty obvious. Why do you not know? And it's 100% of the time it's the failure in communication. And I saw this issue start to creep up in here with all the different interactable components. You see, there are some interactable components here that can be interacted with a button press, easy peasy, and there are some that are physical interactable components, which is a mechanic that I'm borrowing from the frictional games, Soma and Amnesia and whatnot. There is a difference between a switch that can be pushed with a press of a button and a switch that needs to be physically pulled with your mouse. And it was around this time that I figured maybe I should take the moment to communicate to the player what kind of an interactable this is. So I did what any point-and-click adventure game developer does. I took a meaty photo of my hand, slapped it in Krita, and then drew an outline around it. For a brief second, I considered if I should just use the picture of my hairy ape hand, but I think I'll leave that for maybe another time, maybe another title. Another random location that I thought would be a fine addition for this derelict hellscape would be a rickety wooden shack. This is along the same lines of locations that the player randomly comes across as they're exploring the swampland, and the game is going to randomly choose whether or not these locations will have a crafting bench, what loot they will have, what containers, and maybe swap between different furniture layouts. I don't really know how much the random location system is going to benefit to the overall replayability. Maybe we'll have some sort of a roguelike component to it where if you die, you lose the progress, and then either just make that be a part of the game or make it be a mode that you enable. So far, the random locations include the story critical bunker chunks, some shacks, some shipping containers, some just loose props, like for example a tractor that people can use to recharge their batteries. And I am looking for any sort of ideas to expand what kind of random locations the player can discover. It is all in the middle of the swampland, but you could find weird stuff in the swampland, that's fine. These shacks were pretty much built out of duplicates of one single same board, so yeah, design-wise it's pretty straightforward. Now, the elevated stilt solution is actually there for the same exact reason why I have these really tall foundations for the bunker chunks. These can be found in different clusters placed in different locations in the swamp. They could be on top of a little elevation or a little dip. I needed to make sure that the house doesn't spawn in floating or hanging off of the side of a cliff or something. So these foundations, these really tall foundation stilts, would hopefully help to give a little wiggle room. When they spawn in, they can be placed halfway in the ground and still look like they're just firmly rooted in the foundation. Now, another prop idea I got was a health indicator item. It was supposed to offset the need to have any sort of user interface on the screen. You know, the old school gamer in me says just put a nice little health percentage in the bottom left corner of the screen, but the more modern gamer in me kind of says maybe we should try to keep things more immersive and more cinematic and avoid having too much stuff that just clutters the screen. So I figured, okay, well, why not have an item whose specific purpose is to show how much health you have? I went through the whole process, modeling, texturing, programming, and I don't know, it seems like it wouldn't have too many uses. Maybe, but it's already programmed, it's already in there, so maybe just keep it, but don't attract too much attention to it, right? Don't put too much emphasis on it. It really feels like, I don't know, a lot of games nowadays don't show the health bar. They just kind of show the health in a either creative way, or they have some damage vignettes effects that cover the screen, or they have the player do some voice lines that indicate what health state they currently are in. So I don't know, maybe I'll keep it in the game, but I'm not gonna put too much emphasis on it. Who knows? What do you think? It certainly came out to be a really interesting looking prop, but just the utility of it seems questionable. It is definitive that I'm not a fan of having a health bar just on top of the screen over the gameplay. Maybe not, at least for this particular project. I ended up putting more work into the radio tower, adding the multiple segments that move up and unfold as the radio comes back to life. The animation for the entire tower, I was considering whether or not I should do it in Blender or whether or not I should do it in Godot. And in hindsight, I should have just done it in Blender, because as convenient as Godot's animation player is, there are so many quality of life things about Blender's animation tool that I really wish Godot Engine had. Like, for example, the Blender's cursor behavior, like when you go down to the timeline, select a whole bunch of keyframes, and then you click S to scale, and then you can just move your mouse and scale the animation every which way. The fact that you can easily flip the animations upside down by just doing S, Y, -1. You can scale things up. The fact that there is a proportional editor button editing for keyframes, so that you can grab one keyframe and drag it around, and it kind of influences the nearby keyframes at various levels of effectiveness. All of that just makes Blender such a fantastic animation software in comparison to Godot Engine's animation player. Now, I use Godot Engine's animation player node for animating a lot of mechanical things, and guess what? Here's a radio tower. It has mechanical things. It is perfect for the animation player node, and dear God, it was, I don't know why, but there's just something about the animation player that's just missing. A lot of these quality of life things that are just missing, like quickly placing keyframes or having active record. Like, I know somewhere deep in the settings of Godot, there is an auto record button where it automatically places the keyframes. I can't remember where it is. I can't remember if there's a shortcut to enable it. Would have been great if there was a button for it, to be honest, because I can easily, quickly toggle it on and off. But in the end, that was not even the worst part of it. The worst part is yet to come, and in hindsight, I should have just used Blender for the animation. Now y'all better go subscribe to the Retroactive Gamers YouTube channel, or the Fried Chicken Man's gonna get you. Oh yeah, speaking of the tractor, this right here was a pretty interesting prop / gameplay mechanic. Just like you can find random locations with loot and tools and possibly a workbench to craft your survival equipment out of, you might be able to come across this, which is basically a derelict tractor. And I've recently been absolutely fascinated with these YouTube channels, YouTube videos where people go out and they find like old abandoned cars, like either in the barn or back of someone's yard or just in the middle of the woods, just abandoned equipment. And like these mad lads go in with, nothing but can of WD-40 ether and, grease on their fingers, and they open the thing up, clean it up, and right on the spot, most often they just make it run. Like they bring that dead derelict thing back to life. And I honestly think that is just the coolest content. That just tickles all my fancies. One of those channels, I think, is called Jenkins Motorsports. I would highly recommend you check it out, because this dude can literally bring back to life a literal garbage heap on the side of a highway. There are so many really cool videos of this guy just fixing up really old engines. It actually baffles me how simple the mechanism of an old engine is, of a nice combustion engine. I'm telling you, with the electrical vehicles, ain't nobody gonna be fixing shit. With internal combustion engines, all you got to do is pretty much most of the time replace the oil, lube up the pistons, and I don't know, spray a little bit of ether until the engine warms up. With electrical motors, well, you better get your math ready, because you're going to be doing swapping windings, resoldering components on motor controllers. So, anyways, I'm getting sidetracked with this. So, yeah, I figured, you know what? I like the kind of content. Why don't we give the player the ability to actually interact with this prop? So the basic mechanic behind it is that the player can, if they discover this tractor in the middle of nowhere, they can use the motor on it in order to charge their battery. So they place the battery in the middle of the opening where that little empty slot in the motor is, and then they have to manually spin the flywheel like any other rigid interactable component in order to charge up their battery. And I'm being pretty lenient with these charging mechanics because I allow the player to pre-spin the flywheel or the dynamo machine in order to, let's say, get some speed up. So they could spend like a minute just up spinning the thing, and then once it's up to whatever their desired speed is, which has no theoretical limit, they could just take the battery, plug it in, wait 2 seconds for the thing to charge, and then take it out. It's unrealistic, but at the same time, the player did choose to spend a minute up spinning this dynamo machine or the flywheel. Why not let them have their fun and have them charge their batteries that way? Whatever, it's a game. Now, from time to time, I tend to come back to an older prop and see if I can maybe improve it in some way. In this case, I decided to put a little bit more time into the radio tower. Now, the radio tower started as just this vertical tube in the middle of nowhere, and I figured, well, maybe it seems a little too barren as it is right now. So I decided to give it a foundation, give it some fencing, give it plenty of surface space to place additional props like electrical insulators, like heavy duty big ceramic insulators, some cabinets for wires, and some place for a game mechanic which is yet to come. Leave enough room for growth, so to speak. Now, ever since the comms room wall fiasco, I've actually started taking a much more modular approach to pretty much the majority of the props. Like, for example, all of the fencing is made dynamically. It's separate scenes, separate props. They're not hard tied to the radio tower location, so that I can reuse these in all sorts of different places. This is being applied to really anything as big as city infrastructure prop to anything as small as a switch or a lever. Even the programming for these things is made in such a way where it is indescript to any particular mechanic. I can make a switch flip a door, or I can make it flip a light. I can make it flip a major story component. I think I've just had enough of single-use mechanics and single-use applications for one lifetime. Too much wasted time, too much wasted potential. And in hindsight, of course, I find the location turn out way better than just a tube in the middle of nowhere. Looks a lot more enticing to explore, interesting to visit and figure out what it is. Now, of course, a lot of this prop making is also going to be beneficial for once I get to Automicon, because the art style that I'm practicing here with all the ceramic, insulators, big vintage designs and beveled corners and all the signature Art Deco stuff, All of this is going to be used in the Automacon project, and I think it's a good idea to use this one as a practice run. Here's another fun location I thought was worth slapping together. This is a derelict destroyed water tower. Okay, now pretty much everything in this game is derelict, so I don't know if using that term is all that useful. If everything is derelict, nothing is derelict. Now, the game will feature a number of these high-up locations. There's the telephone pole with a little sitting station. There's a overland water tower or a water pipe conduit. There's this water tower. There's a windmill. Even, I think, the top of the chapel is supposed to be used as a refuge location. And there's supposed to be a particular scripted event that comes at regular intervals that prompts the players to seek an elevated location in order to stay safe. It's kind of like a cataclysmic event that the players need to prepare for and avoid, and its purpose is to spice up the otherwise pretty standard gameplay of go here, get a piece of lore, unlock a puzzle, and then get a component for the final final quest. Hopefully it's going to help break the monotony of it, because it's always something that you need to keep an eye out. You need to be mindful of the time. Maybe we can have some props whose sole purpose is to communicate how far away one of those events is. Kind of like miners in their mining operations had to involve canaries, which acted as a visual feedback on whether or not they might have hit a deadly pocket of gas. If that happened and the gas, for the most part, would be odorless, the canary would die, they would see it, and they would extract, saving the miners' lives. Maybe we can have something along those lines in this game as well. Certain props that are scattered all over the place that act as indicators that the event is coming. I will be looking out for ideas of other elevated locations, because we want to make sure that there's enough for the players to go around. So, it was finally around this time that I decided to texture the radio locator device. This is a hero item. It is a component that the players can be using quite a lot in their travels, in their survival quest. It is a device that is used to use the radio to locate some sort of a location that the player needs to reach. It's meant to help address a particular problem. You see, the level is randomly generated, so the locations are randomized. The type of locations you get are still the same, but their location on the map is going to be always different. So I needed to make it so that the player has a way of finding the location without having to just blanket search, canvas search the entire map and try to make a record of everything, because that doesn't sound fun. I wanted to make it random, but I also wanted to make sure that the player does have a way of locating whatever they need to locate. So that's where the gameplay mechanic of the radio locator and the radio decoder came to be. The radio locator is supposed to be used by the player to punch in a channel frequency and minor frequency, and they would start listening to a kind of a hollow ping coming out of the speaker of the radio locator, and as they turn around, the ping would get louder or quieter, and the visual indicators would show whether or not they're facing the right direction. All they have to do is follow the signal until they reach their destination. Now, all of the radio coordinates, just giving them away isn't really all that fun. Like, giving the player stuff for free isn't really gameplay. So there's another mechanic that I ended up involving that the players can play in order to get the channel data that they input into the radio. We are making a game, so we should try to gamify as much of interesting stuff as possible and avoid giving the player stuff for just free. Oh yeah, speaking of giving the player stuff for free, they have to somehow procure these coordinates, and the way that's going to be done is by one of 3 randomly chosen minigames. Somewhere in the swamps, there's a location where the player can find a console. This console accepts a set of 4 digits, which the player can find while exploring the location. There's a whole slew of these 4-digit numbers, and each one corresponds to a particular location out in the swamps. So the player will have to take the 4 digits, input them into a console, and then a random minigame is going to be chosen for them to complete. It's a small puzzle-based, very simple logical challenge, and upon completion, an output console is going to provide them with a major frequency, minor frequency, and a channel, which they input on the radio locator, and off they go. I remember way back in the deep ether of childhood, we used to sneak around this abandoned construction site that had a lot of construction equipment on it, and we'll get into the dozers, the cranes, and mess around with the levers and stuff. That was the time of my life. So that kind of experience really left a very interesting sci-fi appreciation for just old abandoned technology. So that's what I decided to bring into this game with me. So you can expect a lot of hardware interactions, a lot of reviving of old derelict equipment, tapping into all sorts of old vintage hardware, and of course a lot of the challenges are going to be relatively simple puzzles. Oh yes, and of course the final stage of this entire mechanic is that the player gets their channel numbers that they input into the radio locator, and then they can follow the signal to get to the destination. Now, of course, I wanted to make sure that there's a physical prop representing the beacon that they can hear over the radio, so that's the prop that I ended up putting together here. I just borrowed some perforated mesh components from the radio locator, which, funny enough, that's all geometry. I probably should have done a texture and it would have been a lot faster and easier. But oh well, you know, hindsight 2020, maybe next time. The player will be able to actually point the radio locator right at the thing and hear the beacon loud and clear, just so that it doesn't sound like the beacon's just coming from nowhere. I also ended up spending a little bit of time revamping the material, the screen material of our terminal, because so far it's just black screen with green text on it, and I wanted to add the scan lines, the distortions, the flares, the glares, all the good jazz. I always found it interesting how exactly developers for post-apocalyptic games manage to get the screen to display the picture of the user interface and still have a bunch of crap on top of the display that obscures the same picture. Like, the screen could still reflect the environment and still show what is on the screen of the computer. It took a little bit of finagling, but the visual shader editor in Godot had actually come in super handy for something like this. Like, it is actually a godsend. I gotta say, the visual editor has come in so handy at creating some really interesting visual effects without having to delve into the shader code. So, you know, just tossing a bit of a shout out to whoever was responsible for the visual shader toolset, because this shit's pretty goddamn awesome. I ended up doing some prototyping of locations, trying to figure out some interesting spaces for the player to be in, and while I have some particularly vivid imagery, I failed to see a utility in some of these places, so a lot of the experimentation ended up being just loosely placing geometry here and there, and then ending up with some, I don't know, just random crap that I wouldn't really necessarily say is useful. I think in this case I need to spend a little bit more time on the story progression, the script, and see if there's a particular obstacle that I can retrofit that moves the story forward but makes this type of environment necessary. I think it's also exceptionally easy to just get lost in meaningless level creation where you make spaces that look interesting but have no functional or narrative purpose in the story. And honestly, at that point, I probably would have been better off just spending my time making some office props or filler props or, you know, something that would actually be tangible. Like, look at this thing. It looks like something Palpatine would be delivering his speech on. While the general shape may look interesting, I don't really have a practical use for it. But it's very difficult to just stop, because you look at it and like, this looks cool, but what is it? Another prop I thought I should spend some time remaking is the wall black box. It's essentially an audio recorder that is mounted on the wall, and it contains the tapes that progress the most important parts of the narrative forward. These are stationary, and the player cannot take them out, specifically for the purpose of making sure that the player doesn't accidentally lose the tape that moves the story forward. The previous version of this machine, I swear to God, looked like some sort of a diner jukebox. And it was ginormous, just absolutely impractical, both as a prop and as a fictional recording device. It does nevertheless look cool, so I think I'm just going to relegate it to some sort of an archival room the player will be able to find in the swamps. There is technically a section of the game where the player has to join 3 tapes together using a decryption key, so maybe we'll place this as like a computer of a sort, analog computer in that location. A remote control is going to be required for the player to interact with these black boxes, and those will be fairly ubiquitously found all around the bunker chunks. Now, the remote will end up emitting a signal whenever it gets close enough to a black box, indicating to the player that there is something here for them to listen to. And of course, once in proximity, the player will be able to interact with the black box, have it play back the sound, play back the tapes, and move the story forward. I ended up moving the radio decoder coordinate console to a different location and experimenting a little bit with occlusion nodes. Keep in mind, at this point in time, I'm still running in Godot 3.x. This is the version of the engine the project had started in, and I was just sticking to it because I figured it's better to just finish the project and then upgrade to Godot 4 with the next one than having to slug through the porting process, which in my experience has always been a pain in the ass, and there's just always a slew of things that ends up being broken afterwards. I took a moment to address how is the player going to be able to defend themselves, which started off as a makeshift sledgehammer made out of a pipe and a cinder block and some wire. Besides the cinder block, the rest is pretty much made out of existing components that are already present in the game. Of course, this means that we'll have to add the cinder block as a discoverable loot item. And the general mechanic behind the cinder block is that they will be able to, when they petrify an enemy using a flashbang or some sort of a flashing device, they will be able to then smash it with a sledgehammer in order to destroy it. Otherwise, it has a chance of coming back to life. Now, this actually brings in the very first item that will now require some sort of a custom takeout animation. Up until this point, we've been dealing with things like generic items like flashlights and flashbangs, capacitors, wire, pipe. All of these are just generic items which can be taken out by a simple transform interpolation. They go from the down position to the up to the side of the camera position. Simple enough. But with the hammer, it doesn't really work. This really requires something a bit more personal. So this is where I ended up making a custom takeout animation in the hammer using the animation player node and programming the item to play that animation if one is detected. Otherwise, it just defaults to a standard takeout. Now, once again, this is where I started experiencing a little bit more of that animation player pain in the assery. There's apparently a difference between a Bezier rotation track and a 3D object rotation track, and unfortunately the 3D object rotation track does not offer Bezier curves, so you can't really do those smooth curves, slowing down and speeding up and simulating the weight by having it bounce up and down, because curves aren't a thing. But if I don't use the 3D rotation track and instead I use the rotation XYZ Bezier curve tracks, oh boy, is there going to be problems with rotation being out of whack, not being correctly rotating, it going 360 degrees or not when I need it to, because, rotation, when it tries to deal with rotation, it will take the shortest path possible, and that may not be the path I want it to take. So if I want to be able to deal with that, I have to use the 3D rotation track, which is stiff as shit. Like, you cannot make expressive animations with the 3D rotation track, which isn't really good when the 3D rotation track is perfect for handling rotations how you want to. So, once again, I found myself wishing I was just using Blender for these sort of animations. Now, this is where shit gets good, because after implementing the sledgehammer, I started thinking, can't we use this thing to clear some sort of obstacles besides using it in combat? Because once again, I don't want to spend all this time animating and modeling and implementing and programming this thing just so that it would just do one thing, right? So I figured, okay, why don't we make bashable walls, right? It's a structurally inferior wall, a structurally compromised wall that the player can bash in using their sledgehammer. But how can I go about achieving something like this? Well, I have already technically done a bunch of experimentation with something of this nature back when I was trying to do a scripted crumbling statue event in the Angular project. When the players have a flyby into the location, when they first get introduced to it, they kind of fly into this beam and it crashes into a statue and it crumbles upon impact. Well, the problem is I tried to use rigid bodies in the Grata engine and just making every chunk of the statue be a rigid body, but that made the crumbling animation too inconsistent between plays. I would play it multiple times, dozens of times, it would be different every time. And that's not good, because what if a piece of the statue happens to fall in the place where the player needs to get through, and now it's just there, right? Not good. So my next approach was to animate the statue crumbling. But can you imagine trying to animate physics by hand? So what I ended up doing is simulating the physics in Blender, fracturing the wall, cutting a hole in it, taking all the chunks, making them rigid bodies, having Blender simulate the physics of everything falling down and crumbling. But then I had to somehow capture that into the animation, and the only way you can do that is with bones. I needed some sort of an armature to be able to capture the motion of all the chunks, and there's like 3 dozen of them. Am I gonna go through each and every one of them, creating a bone for each and every one of them, parenting and assigning the vertex groups of each and every one of them, and then baking the animation for each and every... No. No. I know what it's like to do all that nonsense by hand. I do not want to do it by hand. So I guess we're learning how to make Blender plugins now. It's fine. It's Python. I've experimented with this stuff before. It took a little bit of time to figure out how to address individual objects, but in the end, I ended up creating a plugin that, well, fairly simple. First, you select every single chunk that you want to turn into an animation. Then you press a button, or technically you just run the script, and what it's going to do is automatically create an armature, automatically create all the bones at the position and rotation of each and every chunk. It will then go to each and every chunk, enter the edit mode, select all the vertices, create a vertex group that happens to match the same name as the bone that the chunk is getting attached to, and then selecting all the chunks, lastly selecting the entire armature, and then parenting the chunks to the armature using armature deform with the existing vertex groups. Then when I hit space and let the physics play out, I see all the chunks fall down and I see all the bones follow along. Keep in mind, the reason the bones are following along the chunks is because every single bone had a constraint modifier added to them that tells them to follow whichever stone chunk they're responsible for. So all I have to do now is tell the armature to bake its animation using visual keyframes, which means as the bones are following the crumbling rock, they're going to bake their location or rotation into actual keyframes, and then finally we tell every single bone to get rid of their constraint modifier, and that's it. The rocks should now be following the bones instead of the bones following the rocks. This tiny little script is gonna be so handy for scripted events of all sorts of cinematic goodness. I actually can't wait. This is gonna be freaking awesome. While I was on the subject of bashable walls, I figured I'll add a bit of a post-processing overlay effect where as the player destroys stuff or there's debris flying everywhere, the edges of the screen get progressively dirtier. Now this is where the animation player came in super handy, because I could animate the gradual increase of dirt and grime and stains and all sorts of shit in your eyes over the course of, let's say, 10 seconds, and then I can control where along the timeline position the animation player is sitting, so it's quite literally almost acting as a blend space for this animation. I just seek the animation backwards and forward and either worsen or clean up the player's screen. You know, credit where credit is due. I spent the next little while creating some modular bunker construction kit pieces. These were made out of broken foundations, broken ceilings, walls, floors, all sorts of stuff. You see, all the locations, or at least the majority of the locations that the player finds in the swampland, are supposed to look like they have been literally ripped apart. They've been ripped out chunk by chunk and scattered across the swampland. Imagine somebody had a ginormous Titanus-size ice cream scooper and they just started going at the building or a concrete foundation of a bunker. This actually allowed me to explore the Blender sculpting tools and find out some really interesting features, like being able to apply the texture onto the brush, and simply using Blender's own built-in Voronoi noise algorithm, you could actually create a very nice looking rock geometry. So all in all, we actually ended up with some really nice bunker building pieces, and we're going to be using them throughout the rest of the spaces. Now, by this point, we have done so much in this project. We've made so many textures, so many materials, so many props. All the mechanics seem to be working just fine. Let's destroy everything by upgrading to Godot 4 now, shall we? Yes, I finally upgraded this project to Godot 4. And my god, were a lot of things broken. Like, a lot. Almost everything was broken. You know why I didn't want to upgrade? It's because shit would be broken and I would have to... whatever. The next, I think, maybe 10 hours were spent hunting down a slew of missing materials. Some of the mechanics, some of the code was ported automatically. Others, especially rigid bodies, which predominantly make all of our inventory items, were not fixed because Godot 4 deals with freezing rigid bodies, where in Godot 3 you make them not move around by changing their mode to static. Yeah, that was fun. You know what else is fun? Having to reanimate every single thing that used the animation player node. Yay. That was the biggest pain in the ass. I have lost so much animation data. I've lost the animation for the takeout, for the sledgehammer. I lost the animation for the radio tower extending, which was a beautiful animation, and I lost it all. Hey, hey, hey. And this is exactly why I think I'm not going to be using Godot Engine Animation Player to animate anything that is more important than turning on a light. You'd think by this point somebody would have some sort of, I don't know, an importer tool that can handle it for you, or why don't you not delete the frames and the tracks, keep the legacy ones, give us an option to maybe, I don't know, copy paste them onto another track? Jesus, so much lost animation. As per the usual porting process shenanigans, this one sucked. As a matter of fact, I'm still hunting down various little itty-bitty things that are still broken all over the place. But that's besides the point. Yeah, the next few episodes have pretty much been all about me hunting down the bugs, running the game, seeing if I can interact with something, of course it crashing, and fixing what was wrong with it. Standard practice. Nonetheless, pain in the ass, but I digress. Yes. I gotta say, the worst of it is probably losing the radio extension animation. I mean, look at what we've lost. Interact with it, so it's still kind of tolerable. Deploying. Nice. That was a really nice looking animation, but hopefully, once I remake it, it will be better than before. In any case, the remainder of the next few sessions has pretty much been spent on tracking down broken materials, broken shaders, broken animation, missing animations, broken code, broken mechanics. It's fine, it's part of the process. You learn to love it. Now, I have a lot more to report on, but I haven't yet uploaded it to the Concept Bay website because I have a 20 gigabyte a week limit. Gonna have to wait on that one. So, this is it for this report. Wait until maybe, I don't know, next week? 2 weeks from now? And maybe I'll be able to report on the rest of it. Because, oh boy, have we done quite a bit. Alright, that's gonna be it for this report. One video for one game. The rest of the games I'm going to report in other videos later down the line. So, thanks everybody for watching. Appreciate the company. And hope to see you in the next update/livestream. And one final thing is make sure to go to the Retroactive Gamers YouTube channel and hit subscribe, because that channel needs it way more than this one does. See ya, folks.